When did you start working with the pseudo-historical stories, and particularly the ones circulating in the Finnish and Russian World Wide Web about the ancient Finnish kings?
In my PhD, which was about foreign trade relations between Poland and Soviet Union, I realized that there were certain cultural features and cultural kind of information flows that affected that trade. And after my PhD, I joined this international research project in which we studied the circulation of news globally in the 19th century press. And in that project, we used text reuse detection algorithms to see how the news actually was spreading from one country to another. And also we could detect some like fake news there. And then I was discussing with a colleague of mine, Reima Välimäki, who is a scholar on medieval history. And he said that he had been following some internet discussions in Finland and kind of like how people in general talk about medieval history. And there, among all these hobby history, people, just loving history and talking about it and maybe speculating something, he had realized that there are certain groupings advocating this kind of like narratives of history that are not true, but they were saying that they are revealing the truth and all the others are lying, and these kinds of like conspiration theories behind that. And he also realized that there were certain connections to Finnish extremist political parties and even some members of parliament that were kind of like advocating these false narratives. And he had also realized that there are certain kinds of like borrowings or connections to Russian internet as well. So that's why we made this project.
So what do these stories tell?
Oh yeah, so there are a lot of very interesting stories. For instance, in the Finnish internet, one of these pseudo-historical stories is this narrative of a great Finnish kings and kingdom of medieval times. This story tells that before Finland actually became part of Sweden in the 12th century, so very early during the Viking Age and so on. So in Finland would have been this kind of like powerful kingdom, and that actually all the monarchs of Europe are actually descendants of this Finnish kingdom. And also there is kind of interesting features that they claim that the Finnish academic scholars and also some heritage organizations and also the Swedish government for some reason are kind of like hiding this truth. And then if we look at the stories in the Russian internet, there are kind of like many different kinds of little groupings advocating these kinds of stories. So actually the story a little bit depends on their perspective. So if there are, for instance, like UFO believers, they have one kind of perspective, whereas if there are these kinds of like Radnavierie advocating neo-paganism, or extremist Orthodox believers, or very patriotic groups. So they all have kind of like a little bit different kinds of angles. But in many of these stories that they are telling is that that Russians have been controlling the whole Eurasia and Europe for many thousands years, and they have possessed very high technology. Sometimes they have had even colonies in space in certain stories. One of the generic features maybe is that there is this contestation with the West. So there is a lot of explanations why the Westerners in a way hate Russia, and that there is this kind of like ongoing information war against Russian people and Russians, and that's why they have been concealed this truth about their great history.
And is it possible to ascertain the origins of these stories?
These stories are not an invention of an internet era, although they are nowadays circulating there. So some of these stories, for instance, in Finland, have been already circulating in the 1920s, and or even earlier. And also in Russia, there are certain kinds of roots, even in the kind of like in the academic research, that later on the academic researchers have kind of like found out that this is actually not the truth, but these thinkings have remained there. At the moment, I'm studying the connections between Russian and Finnish narratives, and there is one protagonist, Rurik. According to this official view on Russian history, he was one of the founders of the kind of like government structures in medieval Russia. But there has been ongoing speculations on his origin, whether he was a Swedish Viking or a Viking of a Slavic origin. So these kinds of like Norman theory and anti-Norman theory that has been going on in Russia already since the 18th century. But nowadays, this discussion is more or less discussed within these pseudo-historical circles, and now Finnish advocates of pseudo histories have taken this, and they are trying to prove with like genetic research that actually Rurik was a Finn. So there are these many kinds of layers going back to thousands of years of text reuse in a way.
So there's a mix of pure myth making and of outdated historical work.
Yeah. And actually, what is also interesting here is that many of these narratives are based on kind of outdated understandings of a nation. So there is a thinking that a nation is an unchanging entity, that it's kind of like natural and not constructed, and that the language and the culture and the genes remain the same for thousands of years. So this, of course, creates some misunderstandings. Like, for instance, there are some Finnish advocates of pseudo-histories who have been reading some Russian research in which they study like Finno-Ugric tribes in Russia, and using the word Finn, these Finnish advocates think that this actually means the Finns of present day, living in present day Finland.
Were you able to trace the circulation and the spread of these stories?
We have been able to spot certain stories circulating from one website to another, and even the same text is copy pasted, and there can be like 10 years apart. The original author is not necessarily known. And of course, the links to these are also spreading in Twitter and so on. Now it seems to us that from around 2009 until around 2016 was a kind of like golden days of blogs and discussion forums. But now the discussions are more and more going into closed groups within Facebook or the Russian equivalent of Vkontakte. So it's kind of like changing place, but the same stories still remain.
Do you see a change in the way these narratives are used?
This is an ongoing research, so we are still in the process of really looking thoroughly this. But some of these stories have been clearly used in the 1920s and 30s by the right wing in Finland, advocating expansions and so on. And also nowadays, it is possible to see certain kinds of like political uses. There are certain members of parliament that are like right-wing parties in Finland who have been using these narratives to kind of like promote xenophobic thinking. And also, it seems to me that in Russia, particularly in connection to the crisis in Crimea, there was a high peak on larger narrative of Russia being attacked by Western information war. But it was not only within the realms of pseudo-history, but also like higher prestige politicians were using these narratives in their appearances. I must of course say that our data, it was scraped in autumn 2019. It shows only those texts that were available in the internet at that time.
In the abstract of the project online, you mentioned the fact that some of these narratives are now entering or did just enter the mainstream media. How should we understand that? Is that a voluntary move, or is that just an uncontrolled spreading with people picking up the narrative without realizing it's a fake one?
I think it's both. I think most of the people, mainly kind of like reading and maybe kind of like reposting these, are just simply interested in history and speculating and kind of like thinking that maybe this is an interesting viewpoint. But it's also visible that there are certain people who are kind of like using this more deliberately. That's why I think it's also very important to look at how these stories move and what kinds of like dynamics there are, to kind of like understand this phenomenon more thoroughly. We don't want to prohibit people from having history as a hobby and speculating. And I think also there is in the human nature there is this inherent need for myths and all kinds of like stories. But I think that the problem is when somebody claims that something is absolute truth and uses it for political purposes. And what is also problematic in this, and it's kind of like also very clear sign of a pseudo-historical text, is that there is kind of like very clear distinction or black and white worldview. So in a way, it's always we are the good ones and then there are the others who are the bad ones.
Is anybody publicly taking a stand against these narratives?
For now, we have been talking about this particularly in the Finnish media. And we are planning to check how these things are discussed in Wikipedia, for instance, to kind of like clarify these things. There is also an association called Historians Without Borders that was initiated in Finland, advocating this kind of like pluralistic understanding of history and not using black and white histories in for political means.
If we turn to the methodology and the toolkit you use, can you explain how your work works?
Of course, we are using this BLAST text reuse detection algorithm. It's a tool that was originally developed for detecting like biological sequences, but it actually works very well with language as well. It works very simply. It just detects similar parts of text, and then we can see what kinds of sequences there are and chains emerging. That works very well within one language. And within the other project I mentioned, this oceanic exchanges, we're working also in order to be able to detect text reuse across languages. But that's of course a very tough question, and at the moment it doesn't work yet. But that's something that we're trying to find ways to detect these kinds of like leaps from language to another. In addition, we have been using these hyperlink connections between the websites, and also, of course, using other natural language processing techniques. So the data was scraped with Python algorithm. We first collected like seed links of blog posts or websites or forum discussions that somehow contain pseudo-historical texts. And then we scraped those texts to third step, so that we collected also the links and the text behind those links. Also in Russia, for the Russian corpus, we have collected like Russian newspaper data, starting from mid 1990s until 2019. But we haven't been looking at that data yet, but it will be interesting to see how much the discussions in the internet and in the kind of like more prominent newspapers are different. And another thing that I think that is interesting is to look at more these connections between different languages and different countries. Because I think that has not been studied enough. Usually we always focus on one language or one country, but because this problem is global, it's something that we need to kind of like look at how this information moves across borders.
What can you say about the collaboration between social scientists and computer scientists?
I could not work alone or without collaboration with computer scientists, mathematicians. I'm a great advocate of like interdisciplinary research. It's not always easy when you come from, from history background, for instance, to understand what a mathematician or a computer scientist is actually doing. But I think when you are kind of like able to go through that step and really start collaborate, it's I think it's a necessity.
This project wouldn't be possible without the technological tools you are using.
No, it wouldn't. And like, for instance, we have approximately 1.5 million Russian websites. So I wouldn't be talking here. I would be just reading all those texts until the end of my life, and there would be nothing coming out of that. So we need to use new tools also in social sciences and humanities. But of course, we need to think how we use them and create and develop further the methodologies so that they will work for our research problems. So for that, we also need collaboration.